I welcome Self-Employed Australia via teleconference. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full name and capacity in which you appear today?
Ken Phillips, Executive Director of Self-Employed Australia.
Excellent. I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of your remarks, I will invite members of the committee to ask questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to have input into your considerations. Much appreciated. I'll very quickly go through a short summary of our submission. The first thing is that we support this bill. We see it as the second phase of the government's three-phase election commitment in terms of the pay-on-time issues for small businesses. The third leg of the commitment was for the government to require that anyone who did business with government would have to pay within the 20-day term or thereabouts. The first phase was the commitment by the government to pay small businesses promptly within 20 days. That has been done, and we congratulate the government on putting that in place. We note that the Small Business Ombudsman, amongst other people, has raised the issue of mandating payment terms on a much broader scale across the economy. We find that extremely interesting and very pleased that that issue has been put on the table. But we would support that in principle, but we think it's too early to talk about that. We think that we would much prefer that a discussion on that be left to another day after the first three phases have been implemented, and we'd prefer that that issue didn't distract from or delay this current bill. On the practical side, of course, we would have to tell you that from our experience and discussion with small business and everything, that the pay-on-time issue by a country mile comes out as the top issue for small businesses, for the self-employed. Getting the money in on time is more important than just about anything else. At the end of the day, this is about the health of the economy. We don't consider that a market economy is a Wild West economy. A market economy is not one in which the bigger bullies rule. A market economy is one in which the rule of law rules, and trust is the principal thing. And in trust, you're wanting to know that you can trust people to pay you. We think that the COVID situation has demonstrated this very strongly. Lots of businesses, small businesses, would be in a much stronger position now if payment terms to them were within sensible administrative arrangements, 30 days at minimum and more likely 20 days. The supply chain issue, we see that supply chain financing is perfectly legitimate, but only if people are being paid promptly. So if someone's being paid within 20 days and wants supply chain financing to make it 2 days, go for your life. But supply chain financing, as has been used in the economy, is illegitimate. In other words, it has been used as a process to extend payment terms out to 60, 90, even 120 days. That's a rort of the process. We strongly recommend that the committee have a look at the Building and Construction Commission security of payment arrangements. The construction sector is by far the most complicated area in terms of security of payments, and the ABCC has been putting in place procedures around that since, I think, early 2017, and there's a considerable amount of success there. We'd have to say that large businesses have brought this sort of regulation upon themselves. The BCA's code of conduct, or voluntary code in this area, has been a failure, very much. And we've got the evidence that from the ACCC in particular, that in relation to the unfair contract laws, which are now in the process of being beefed up, and we hope that that gets progressed quickly, that the companies, there are far too many companies that just ignored those rules. And to sum the whole thing up, which is the heading of our submission, we say it's not your money, you owe it, pay it. But people have got to remember here that not the issue of being a bank, someone owes money, be honest, be upfront, pay the money. That's the end of my introduction.
Thank you. What I might do is I'll hand over to Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask you, please, how effective you actually think naming and shaming large businesses with long reporting time will be, particularly if that's built into their business models and they've already been attempts to name and shame them? Will this work?
We see this particular bill as a sensible step in terms of assisting the administration of the third step. So the third step saying that businesses that are doing business with the Commonwealth must pay within the 20 days, and this reporting system gives a process for administering that and watching what's going on. So, and this comes out of the experience, I think, also of the ABCC. I'll just declare that I'm on the industry advisory panel for the ABCC on this, so I know what's going on, but anything that I'm saying here is not confidential. I'm commenting on what is in the public domain in the ABCC's reports. And the process that's occurred there in the period of time that I've been on the advisory panel, we've seen a ratcheting up of businesses terribly keen to make sure they report, because if they don't report, they will lose access to the government contracts. And in some respects, there's almost been over-reporting. So I see this current bill before the Senate as a sensible step in terms of the administration of the third step being the requirement to pay on time if you're doing business with government.
Okay, so that underscores the urgency of this legislation as underpinning those government payment times in order to continue to have access to government contracts. But separate to that, do you think that a 30-day maximum payment time is a good idea?
We would say, we would concur that I think now a 20-day period would be. 30 days is fine at the moment. What we're saying is that we live in a society where the payment should occur within what is a sensible administrative process. So if we go back some years before the days of the technology that we now have, 30 days was reasonable because that was a period of time in which you could expect people to do the administration. These days, of course, I have clients myself as a self-employed person. I get paid within 3 or 4 days. And the speed with which you can get paid these days is fantastic. And we would certainly say that 20 days would make a lot of sense. But if the legislation says 30 days, well, we're not fussed about that.
Okay, so I'm just unpicking this a bit. Whilst in some senses the legislation names and shames for providers that don't have government contracts, in effect it underpins the compliance for those who want to continue to have access to government contracts. So there's part of it where it does go beyond naming and shaming because it enables that pressure on governments to make sure that that in order to have access to government contracts, they've got that transparency with the suppliers that they are receiving goods or services from. So in effect, that part of it goes beyond the naming and shaming. Do you think, though, that in looking at how you get greater compliance more broadly with paying on time, that finding a way of mandating maximum payment times is a good idea?
Across the broader the community in relation to the payments from large businesses to small businesses, if large businesses want to play games with each other about how they pay each other, that's for them. But in relation to small businesses, in principle, we are supportive of a much broader mandating. But as I've said in our submission, we think let's get these 3 phases in place now, and the mandating issue, let's see how this progresses, and then we can take the next step later on and have a debate around that based on, I think, what will give us considerable more facts. I think one of the things that we have to remember here in terms of if someone wants to do business with government and they have to pay their small business suppliers on time, let's just take Coles, any of the supermarket chains, for example, who in the past have been notorious for not paying on time, that if the supermarket chain is unable to sell pens, paper and pencils to the government sector because they are not paying small businesses on time, I think that's going to provide a very strong commercial focus for the supermarket chains to make sure they're paying on time. So I think the government has got a commercial leverage here for pay on time that the government should use.
Do you think...
I think that will cascade through a lot of the economy. I think it will address a lot of issues.
But essentially you say there does need to be something additional to this bill, and, it's still open to us to consider what that might look like here and now, of course, without compromising the urgent need to implement this in the interests of the economy now. But you recognise that self-regulation won't in and of itself work, because essentially you're already pointing to the best bits of this bill where, in fact, there can be levers that put the onus on ensuring that that payment is mandated and that that's happening through that government leverage. So that leverage is an important principle to recognise, that this isn't about self-regulation working ultimately, is it?
No. Well, we can go on the experience here that the voluntary code by the Business Council of Australia was followed by a number of companies, and they put through, but a very large number of their own members ignored it. So we know that the code, in a lot of respects, the BCA code, was a public relations exercise rather than an actual exercise in getting payments happening on time. We know from the unfair contract laws that the initial phase of those back in 2015, when they were passed, and there was a year in which companies could do the implementation, the ACCC is exceedingly disappointed at how they had to keep fighting this the whole way through, and that companies just were not interested in complying with a lot of companies not interested in complying with the spirit of the legislation. So, and even with the Australian Building Construction Commission experience in the construction sector with pay on time, there is a very, very small number of companies who have thumbed their nose at the ABCC on this. It's just extraordinary, I find. But so there will be businesses around that will seek to play, and some of those very large businesses will seek to play Wild West with our market economy. But I balance that out by saying there are also a considerable number of large firms that have shown that they intend to comply or are complying with the spirit of the law. So I don't distract from them and throw them all into the same basket. But yes, there will be people who will just say, no, we're big, we're strong, we're going to leverage and use our muscle.
But essentially, if we want to legislate mandatory maximum payment time, in effect, we don't really, if people are behaving well, we don't need to mandate it for them, do we?
Oh, no. If we're finding that we're getting very high levels of compliance by this three-phase process, well, I'm not in the business of, there's no need to be the tough cop if you're already getting the results on the ground. Let's move for the lightest touch regulation we can. Hopefully that will work. Hopefully large firms en masse will decide that this is a sensible thing for them to do, and that we don't need to take the next step. But if we do, I think that should be held in reserve.
So in terms of your knowledge and experience with the ABCC, the conflicts that they've followed up in relation to non-payments and not untimely payments, are they examples where the payments aren't made within the initially contracted time? Is that the trigger at which they can intervene?
They can intervene at a whole range of areas. So there's a requirement on companies that have a contract with the government and their subcontractors as well. So it follows down through the chain. There is a statute obligation on them to report if they have failed to pay on time. So even if they don't report that they've failed to pay on time, they are in breach of the requirements just by not reporting. So one of the things that's happening here is that there's a tendency to over-report because the messages clearly got into the payment sections of these companies. So even if they're a day late, they're reporting, and often when the ABCC then goes to investigate, the payments have already been made by the time the ABCC started to investigate. So there's this tendency to over-report, which is showing that this thing's very successful.
And can I just drilling down into that, in effect, where some people raise concerns that if you mandate payment times, that payment times will blow out to the regulated time. In effect, your experience of the ABCC shows that that's not the case.
No, I think that argument's a load of twaddle. Complete twaddle.
Can you explain why you think that is the case in the context of the ABCC?
I think that's an argument being put up by people who are clearly showing that they have an intent to play the system, to gouge the system, and to use every advantage they can to squeeze out another day's payment terms. I think they are people not to be listened to because they are companies that are exposing themselves as being manipulators of the system wherever they can get away with it for an extra buck or there.
So it's a case of they would say that, wouldn't they?
Of course they would.
Yeah.
So red herrings and all of that sort of stuff.
The reporting time threshold stop at 61 days and above. Many businesses have payment times of 120 days, sometimes more. Will the current bill allow those businesses with long payment times to hide the fact that they do if they appear beyond the 61-day threshold?
Look, what we've seen in the past and the case studies on this sort of thing and even the anecdotal studies is that and this is particularly so in, say, in the construction sector, is that companies that have an intention not to pay on time will play all sorts of games. So you'll get this happening in the construction sector in particular. So, for example, look, a subcontractor who installs windows and the contractor says, look, you didn't install the windows properly, so therefore we're not going to pay you. So therefore, if one window hasn't been installed properly, they won't pay for all of the windows. So you get this sort of game going on. Often that's generated by line managers who will have KPIs around payments, around their profitability, their own bonuses, et cetera, so they'll play games around that sort of thing. They're very easy to get away with. One of the complications that the ABCC has to deal with is working out what is a genuine dispute over a faultily installed window in comparison to just a gameplay to extend it out. So that sort of thing has to be handled, obviously, on the ground. And companies that have a culture and an intent and systems in place that encourage delayed payments will have those sorts of things go on. I've got to say the experience, it would appear with the ABCC, that those companies tend to be in the minority, fortunately. The ABCC reports very strong cooperation from numbers of companies that said, oh, look, basically, our systems are not as good as they should be, and the ABCC has been working with them to improve their systems. And so that's all very, very positive stuff. And certainly these days with technology, the capacity to be able to check, authorise, process payments and so forth, there's no excuse for not processing payments quickly. The technology.
I would imagine that a failure to have a reasonable turnaround in your payment time actually undermines your capacity to stand up for the quality of the work that you've contracted someone to provide, does it not? Because essentially the conversation that you're having about the quality of that work can be delayed out months after it was actually completed, rather than that conversation starting sooner rather than later.
And it becomes very difficult. If you can identify a problem quickly, address it quickly while it's fresh in people's minds. If it drags on and on and on and on, and you're addressing an issue that is, 90 days old, people go, hang on a sec, what was that issue about? So the administrative delay creates incredible inefficiencies right through the economy in millions of little ways.
Yeah, I mean, including for consumers who might be the ultimate purchaser of the house or whatever, that has had these problems embedded in the payments and resolution of it.
Yep. It's a cascade through the whole economy. That the pay on time, improving the pay on time and getting this to happen is frankly a microeconomic reform that will have result in increased efficiency through the economy. It's one of those things where it's not a big picture reform that you can sort of say, we've floated the dollar or something like that, but it's one of those ones where it really gravitates, as you indicate, right through to the consumer, on the ground, getting issues fixed quickly. Being in business is it's as much about not only delivering a quality, but the backup service that you provide and the resolutions of problems. Good firms, good businesses fix problems quickly, and they will succeed more because they do fix problems quickly. So this is very much an efficiency issue for the economy.
I'll be asking anyone that ever builds anything for me, not that I've, what their payment times with their contractors are. I think that's very good advice. The department, have they had conversations with you about the framework and small business identification tool? And you've said that you want to see the bill passed quickly, but that remains to be determined. How quickly do you think that can be settled? What should it look like? And what has the department told you about it?
I haven't had any discussions with the department on that. One of the game plays that we see that some businesses get involved in, and this you'll find in the lobbying, will have fairly smart lawyers and accountants who will start to argue the toss about how you make the definition of small business and so forth, because they say, we want certainty and all that sort of stuff. Really what they're doing is they're flagging that they're going to push the legislation to the margins and operate as far out on the margins as they can. So again, I'd be saying be very wary of those sorts of arguments and the people that are putting their arguments along that line too, because they are looking to create space and grey for them in which to be able to play games. The legislation that I really like the most in this sort of area of what is the definition is the legislation that primarily applies with each of the small business commissioners in each of the states. And if there's a dispute with a small business commissioner, there are some parameters around the commissioners declaring that someone is a small business, but there's a very heavy capacity of the commissioners in each state to have a discretionary power to declare someone to be a small business. And
should they have a discretionary power in this case if a particular business has had a poor record in payment time, referring them into the scheme?
Well,
Would that also be a good idea?
just on that, Senator Perry, I'll make that your last question before I hand over to Senator Davey.
Rather than just targeting it at very big business, should there be circumstances under which businesses that are just outside that threshold are referred into it because they have poor practice in this regard?
I think that we should in principle, I think that having that discretionary power for whoever is the regulator in this to be able to make that declaration. And I think that, frankly, large businesses that are going to willingly comply with this will not be scared of a fairly broad definition.
Thank you. Senator Davey.
Yes, thank you. I just want to bring you back to the comment you said about mandatory reporting timeframes and the people who are saying that they've got their worry is that it would actually have the unintended consequence to extend some already favourable payment times, and you said that that's twaddle, and they would say that because they're obviously representing people who want to play at the fringes. The committee has actually received submissions from several people raising that concern, people who I would also say represent small businesses, and certainly in the case of the Australian Fresh Produce Alliance, they have raised significant concerns given the way horticulture and agriculture works, and that they actually use payment terms as a differentiation and a point of competition to service their smaller growers. So do you agree that there is some sectors of our economy who have legitimate concerns about someone like Coles or Woolies, for example, extending out to the 30 day as a minimum, which actually snowballs down and impacts the small, self-employed farmer or the small businesses who are at the bottom of the supply chain?
I spent 8 years running a jobs placement program for the Cambodian refugee community in Melbourne. And one of the things that I was doing there was supplying people, obviously, you're dealing with some refugees, uneducated, et cetera, and so we're putting a lot of people into the picking industry in the farms. I dealt with farmers, particularly down the Gippsland area, who would complain to me that a particular supermarket would put in a big order or peas or whatever it might be. Once the peas were all put into the ground and were growing and so forth, the company would turn around and say, oh, look, no, we're going to halve the order unless you cut the price by 2/3. In other words, it was a process of extortion as far as I was concerned. And so I'm very, very aware of this sort of gameplay that has historically gone on between a number of the supermarkets and their suppliers. But let's look at it this way. If the government implements a third phase of this process and a supermarket chain decides that it's going to play funny games with their suppliers, the pea grower, for example, and start to pay out to this sort of maximum thing and play around with that, well, what you've got here is does the supermarket really want to play these games and put at risk the broader contracts that they have with the supply of pens and papers and so forth to government? I think that commercial leverage is very, very powerful, and it needs to be used. It needs to be in their face. They need to be very aware of it. In other words, there are consequences for paying, commercial consequences for playing these sorts of games. Once that's in place, I think we're then able to have a look at is there behaviour modification occurring with the supermarkets? Are these sorts of games being played? And do we need to move towards mandating? And certainly I think with the experience of the ABCC, having a sort of an overseer, a watchdog on this that's having a look at this sort of thing, you know, a knock on or a phone call to the CEO of one of the supermarket chains that says, do you know that X is happening with the pea growers down in Gippsland? Are you aware that this is occurring? And most of the time you'll find they're not. And are you aware that we don't look on this in a very kindly manner? I think those sorts of phone calls generate a response.
So, just for clarity, because you think there are things that we can put in place in the interim. So if we've got this reporting framework that's out, it's public, there's a register, but then we can also put in place practices or policy areas that don't require legislation, such as procurement policy processes that would also assist to change behaviour. We may not need to go down the onerous path of actually mandating payment terms and then enforcing that.
I think the issue of the Commonwealth Government and other governments using their commercial leverage in this space is probably speaks to companies vastly more loudly than legislation. So even in the mandated area, for example, and this is the experience with the unfair contract laws, how long does it take for a regulator to progress a prosecution of a company that stepped outside the law? And how much money is involved? You know, a year, 2 years, 3 years? Well, the damage has already been done to the small business where it all happened. What we're needing here is a comparative commercial speed and being able to respond to be able to get the message through to the larger companies. Well, hang on a sec, there is pain if you behave in this way, and in my experience, they will respond to that much, much more quickly than they will respond to a prosecution where they can line up lawyers from one end of Burke Street in Melbourne to the other end of Burke Street and spend X amount of money because they reason, well, look, if we're squeezing the payment times here, it means that we've got cash flow. Remember, for a company like any of the supermarket chains, the pushing out of payment terms is not hundreds of millions of dollars that we're involved with here in terms of money. They don't have to go to the bank. You're talking billions. Mm. And so this is big dollars that's on the table here. And of course, if the chains are already geared up towards this sort of cash flow situation where they can squeeze it out, in terms of them transforming, they're going to have to either go to the market or to the banks, financiers, to be able to fund this. So I can understand why you people get pushback from them on this. But at the end of the day, the thing that works better than anything else is commercial leverage.
So in the interest of, this is my final line of questioning, Chair, the bill that is before us at the moment, which is the bill that we have to produce a report on, your recommendation is to implement the bill as soon as possible so that we have the reporting timeframe registrar up and running. It's not worthwhile delaying this bill to go back to consult further on mandatory payment terms. We can actually have that discussion separately. Would that be your position?
We would be doing a disservice to the hundreds of thousands of small businesses, or tens of thousands, whatever the number of small businesses who stand to be have an improved situation. So we'd be doing a disservice to the small businesses and a disservice to the economy, particularly in the COVID period, if we were to delay this bill. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, looking at the time, and what I might do is we will suspend for...
Chair, it's not 11 o'clock yet, and I have questions.
If you've got 3 minutes, and you're renowned for one last question, so Senator O'Neill, but...
There are always good ones too, Chair.
Oh, well, 3 minutes, and we'll suspend at 11 o'clock.
Thank you very much for your evidence today, Mr. Phillips. I wanted to give you the opportunity to, considering how many small businesses across the country that you stand up for and I'm concerned for, to name any particularly bad payers at the moment that need to be called to attention so that businesses survive during the COVID period.
Well, the one that comes to mind is immediately, of course, is CIMIC, Australia's largest construction firm, who operate under a variety of names. When they announced the gameplay with the supply chain financing and extending their payment terms out further, I think it was instructive. From recollection, they said that they are not doing this in New South Wales because the New South Wales laws prohibit it. And
you're the second person. The Ombudswoman Kate Carnell mentioned them this morning as well.
Right.
Are they a good example of what you described as operating an exploitative business model as opposed to an ethical business model that impacts the whole small business ecosystem?
Yes, and let's call ethics in a little bit broader terms. What is common sense? What is commercial common sense for the economy? And commercial common sense for the economy, it's not just the ethics of it, the commercial common sense for the economy says get the payment terms happening, get the money moving through the economy as fast as you possibly can. Don't play this sort of gameplay. If a company wants, a large firm needs financing, go to a bank, go to the market, do what you normally do. Small business is not a bank. And the tighter are the payment terms across the entire economy, the healthier is our economy. And the COVID situation, I think, is an extremely good example of that.
Thank you so much. What date do you think the invoice clock should start ticking? The date that it is sent to and documented through like an e-invoicing scheme to the person who should pay? Or is there some other time frame that you think is appropriate?
Look, I think, first off, small businesses do have a responsibility to make sure with the large businesses that there is clarity around that trigger, and that can vary from company to company and situation to situation. So a payment term in supplying the peas might be different from a pea farmer, might be different in the construction sector. Generally, I'd have to say that probably the general principle around this is the delivery of a valid tax invoice to the other party. And if a small business fails to do their administration properly and fails to do their invoicing, well, you know, give us a break here. It does cut both ways.
You can learn from experience there. One final question, if I can. Through the Corporations and Financial Services Committee, of which I'm a member, we saw how significant the KPIs were in that financial service sector, the incentives to bad behaviour, exploitative behaviour. You mentioned KPIs and line managers. Is there a need for some articulation of business practice, even within these businesses that are operating exploitatively, about transparency around the way in which they reward those middle managers? Because as you said, you know, sometimes people at the top don't get to see what's incentivising this behaviour that corrupts the whole small business ecosystem.
Watching the development with the administration with the ABCC and how they approach things, I think it's instructive how quickly most companies changed their KPIs when there was a commercial incentive. So if they have a KPI set up for a middle manager that encourages the middle manager to play games with the payment terms, and there's no consequence to the company for that, well, that will continue. But if the consequence to the company is fear of losing government contracts, well, watch the KPIs change very quickly.
On notice, if I can, Chair, you said that the BCA code was a public relations exercise. I'd love to understand more that time will allow us to here today. So could I ask a question on notice for you to explain why it's so important that in considering this legislation, we are mindful of how codes, legislative instruments can sometimes simply just be a public relations exercise? Because I know, like you, I want small businesses, tradies right across the country to get paid on time and survive and keep employing great people in great jobs.
Thank you for that, Senator O'Neill. And it being past 11 o'clock, we will suspend. Mr Phillips, thank you for your evidence today. We will suspend now for 10 minutes and reconvene at 11 past 11.